is Faith. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been described with words like steady, kind, dependable. I'm the woman who remembers birthdays without Facebook reminders, the one who sends thank you cards, the one who makes sure there's enough food on the table and that no one feels left out of the conversation. People often mistake that for simplicity. They see softness and assume there's no steel underneath it. They see calm and assume there's no depth. And in my marriage, that assumption became the foundation of everything. From the outside, my husband and I looked like the kind of couple people saved to their Pinterest boards. Engagement photos in golden hour light. A wedding that was elegant but not excessive. 6 months later, our holiday card arrived on time with coordinated outfits and careful smiles. What no one knew, what I barely admitted to myself at first, was that our marriage collapsed just 6 months after the wedding. Collapsed quietly. No screaming, no dramatic betrayal exposed at a dinner party. Just something essential that stopped breathing between us. And yet, we kept pretending for 3 more years. We staged photos. We hosted family dinners. We toasted anniversaries with crystal glasses and polite laughter. We performed love like seasoned actors who knew their lines too well to forget them. This isn't a story about revenge. There are no explosive confrontations, no public humiliation, no sudden windfalls or miraculous rescues. It's a story about erosion, about what happens when you slowly disappear inside a relationship while still standing in the center of every photograph. It's about the role I was assigned, the reliable wife, the emotional caretaker, the woman who smooths over tension before anyone else notices it exists. And it's about the moment I stopped smoothing. Over time, I learned something important. Silence can mean surrender, but it can also mean strategy. There is a difference between being underestimated and being unaware. I was never unaware. This story will take you through those 3 years, the pretending, the small cuts, the internal shift no one saw coming. It will show you how a woman can reclaim herself without shouting, without cruelty, without spectacle. Just clarity. If you've ever smiled in a photo you didn't emotionally belong in, if you've ever played a role so well that people forgot to ask how you were really doing, then maybe you'll understand. Have you ever stayed in something long after it quietly ended? Just because everyone else still believed it was alive. To my husband, Daniel, I was the stable one. He said it like it was a compliment. Daniel was ambitious, charismatic, the kind of man who could hold a room with half a story and a crooked smile. At our wedding in downtown Seattle, people told me how lucky I was. They meant well. They saw his confidence and assumed it was a strength. They saw my composure and assumed it was passivity. To his parents, I was the organized one, the woman who made sure holidays ran smoothly. I learned his mother's stuffing recipe after the first Thanksgiving and improved it slightly, but never enough to threaten her pride. I sent anniversary gifts on behalf of both of us. I remembered medical appointments. I tracked family birthdays in my Navy planner long before anyone asked me to. To our friends, I was the calm counterbalance. If Daniel teased too sharply, I'd laugh lightly and redirect the conversation. If he arrived late, I'd smooth it over with a joke about traffic. If he forgot something important, I'd say, "It's okay, I should have reminded you." It became instinctive, like adjusting a crooked picture frame in someone else's house. What no one noticed was how often I adjusted myself. 6 months after our wedding, something subtle shifted. Not dramatically. There was no single catastrophic event. It was more like discovering a hairline crack in glass you thought was solid. At first, you convince yourself it's just a reflection. Daniel began speaking about our life as if it were primarily his. My house, my schedule, my plans. Even though my income covered nearly half the mortgage. Even though I had chosen that house because it was equidistant from both our offices. When I gently correct him, our house, he would smile and kiss my forehead. You're cute when you're territorial, he'd say. Cute. It's strange how one word can shrink you. At dinners, he'd tell stories about our early dating days. Stories that were mostly accurate. Except he'd reposition me slightly. Less decisive, more adoring. He'd say, Faith was so shy when we met, and everyone would laugh. I'm not shy. I was observant. There's a difference. But correcting him in front of others felt unnecessary, small, petty. So I let it slide. I told myself it didn't matter. Identity isn't defined by anecdotes, except over time it is. I became the agreeable wife, the low maintenance partner, the woman who doesn't need much. That last one was my favorite myth. It wasn't that I didn't need much. It was that I learned early in life that asking for much made people uncomfortable. So I needed to be quiet. I needed partnership, not performance. I needed mutuality, not management. I needed to feel chosen, not just convenient. But to them, to Daniel, to his family, even to some of my own friends, I was already complete in their eyes. Calm, capable, unshakable. They thought I was unbreakable because I didn't crack loudly. They didn't see that I was slowly thinning, and invisibility doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small permissions. The first time, you don't correct a false narrative. The first time, you swallow disappointment because it seems inefficient to express it. The first time, you convince yourself that being understood is optional. I wasn't unhappy yet, but I was beginning to disappear. And the most dangerous part, everyone thought I was exactly where I belonged. The first real cut wasn't loud enough for anyone else to hear. It happened on a Tuesday night in early March. Rain pressed softly against the kitchen windows. Seattle doing what Seattle does best. I had just finished plating dinner. Lemon chicken, roasted asparagus, and a bottle of wine I'd picked up on my way home because Daniel had mentioned it was a long week. He walked in still on his phone, not unusual. He worked in business development. Urgency followed him like a shadow. I didn't mind. I understood ambition. I respected it. I waited until he hung up before sitting down. Sorry, he said, glancing at his watch. Big potential client. I figured, I replied, smiling. How did it go? He launched into the details. Numbers, projections, timelines. I listened the way I always did, fully, asking the right questions, reflecting back on what mattered. I had spent years in corporate communications. Active listening was second nature to me. Halfway through his explanation, he paused. You wouldn't really get the back end strategy, he said lightly. It's a little complex. He didn't say it cruelly. That's what made it sharp. I blinked. Try me. He laughed. Babe, it's fine. I'll just handle it. I nodded. On the surface, nothing dramatic had occurred. No insult was shouted across the table. No slammed doors. Just a subtle dismissal dressed up as protectiveness. But here's what made it different. I did understand it. Not only did I understand it, I'd helped shape similar pitches at my firm. I'd been in rooms where executives twice Daniel's age sought my advice on messaging strategy and risk mitigation. And yet, in my own kitchen, I was reduced to someone who wouldn't get it. I could have corrected him. I could have said, actually, I've managed campaigns twice that size. Instead, I chose peace. I told myself he was tired, that maybe he didn't want to rehash work details at home, that it wasn't about my capability, it was about his stress. This is how normalization begins. You reinterpret the moment in the kindest possible way. Later that evening, while we loaded the dishwasher, he added, I like that you don't challenge me on stuff like that. It's refreshing. Refreshing. There it was again, that shrinking sensation. What he meant was, you're easy. And I had spent so many years being proud of that. Easy to love, easy to live with, easy to rely on. But easy can quietly become erasable. That night, I opened my navy leather planner and wrote a single line in the margin of the day's square. Don't forget this feeling. I didn't write it because I was angry. I wrote it because something in my chest had tightened. Not painfully, but precisely. Like a seam pulling just enough to warn you it might split if stretched further. The next morning, Daniel kissed my cheek before work. You're the best, he said. And I smiled. Because on the surface, I was supportive, calm, non-confrontational. But inside, a quiet recalibration had begun. I realized something important in that moment. It wasn't the comment itself that hurt. It was the assumption beneath it. The assumption that my intelligence was secondary, that my role was emotional infrastructure, not intellectual partnership. It was the first time I understood that Daniel didn't see me as his equal in the rooms that mattered most to him. And equality isn't something you negotiate loudly. You feel its absence in silence. No one else would have noticed that dinner was significant. If you'd asked Daniel, he probably wouldn't even remember it. But I do, because that was the night I stopped assuming respect was automatic. It was the night I realized that love can erode not through cruelty, but through casual underestimation. And once you see that crack, you can't unsee it. After that Tuesday, nothing exploded. That's the part people misunderstand about emotional erosion. It doesn't arrive with thunder. It settles like dust, light enough to ignore, persistent enough to change the air. Daniel didn't suddenly become dismissive. He became subtly consistent. At dinner parties, if conversations drifted toward finance or strategy, he would preface my comments before I even spoke. Faith works in communications, he'd say, smiling, as if explaining to me. She's more on the messaging side, more on the messaging side. A tidy way of trimming the rest. I handle crisis simulations, executive positioning, shareholder narratives during acquisitions. I've sat in rooms where one misplaced sentence could cost millions. But in his framing, I was the one who polished sentences, not the one who shaped outcomes. It was never overtly false. That's what made it dangerous. I began noticing a pattern. When I offered opinions in private that contradicted his, he would go quiet, not angrily, just distantly, as if disagreement were an inconvenience rather than a dialogue. I just think you're overanalyzing it, he'd say, or you worry too much about nuance. Nuance is my profession. But slowly, I began adjusting, choosing which insights to voice, deciding which corrections were worth the emotional cost. You tell yourself you're being mature, strategic, that not every thought needs airtime. And that's true. But when you start editing yourself before you even open your mouth, something else is happening. You're rehearsing invisibility. There was one evening in particular that crystallized it for me. We were at his colleague's house, wine glasses balanced on marble countertops, soft jazz playing in the background. The conversation turned to market volatility. I mentioned a communication misstep a major firm had made during a recent downturn. Before I could finish my sentence, Daniel chuckled. She reads a lot of industry blogs, he said warmly to the group. Keeps her entertained. Entertained. The word landed gently. The room laughed politely. Someone refilled my glass. I smiled, and in that moment, I understood something with startling clarity. Correcting him publicly would make me look defensive. Staying silent made me look agreeable, so I chose agreeable. On the drive home, I said nothing. Not because I didn't have words, but because I was studying the pattern. I began noticing how often my intelligence was reframed as a hobby. How often my professional depth was softened into something palatable. And here's the part I'm almost embarrassed to admit. I rationalized it. I told myself Daniel needed to feel competent. That marriage sometimes meant buffering each other's insecurities. That perhaps his sense of identity was deeply tied to being the expert in the room. I convinced myself that shrinking slightly was an act of love. But love that requires reduction isn't love, it's an accommodation. Over time, I started anticipating dismissal before it happened. I'd pre edit my thoughts to sound lighter, less assertive. I softened my language, added more qualifiers. Maybe. Just a thought. I could be wrong. I was not wrong, yet I behaved as if certainty were impolite. It's fascinating how quickly a dynamic can calcify. Daniel began describing me to others as low maintenance, drama free, not like most women. At first, I accepted it as praise. Then I realized what it implied, that having needs or opinions or boundaries would categorize me differently. And I had spent so many years being proud of my composure that I didn't immediately see the trap. Normalizing disrespect doesn't feel like surrender. It feels like harmony. It feels like choosing peace. But harmony without equality is just a well managed imbalance. By the end of that year, I had become exceptionally skilled at reading rooms, smoothing edges, and anticipating tone shifts. I had also become exceptionally lonely, not because Daniel was cruel, but because he was comfortable. Comfortable believing I required less. Comfortable assuming I would adjust. Comfortable in a version of me that was easier to stand beside. And the most unsettling part? I allowed it. Because at that point, I still believed I could manage it quietly. I still believed I could maintain the image without losing myself entirely. I was wrong. There's a moment in every slow unraveling when you stop asking, is this happening? And start asking, what part am I playing in it? For me, that moment didn't arrive during an argument. It came during a Sunday brunch at Daniel's parents' house. His mother was setting the table. His father was explaining a news headline too loudly. Daniel was on the patio, taking a call he insisted he couldn't miss. I was in the kitchen, stirring gravy I hadn't been asked to make, but instinctively had. Faith's so good at this, his mother said, watching me adjust the seasoning. You're lucky, Daniel. She takes care of everything. She meant it kindly, but I noticed something. No one had asked what I wanted. Not about brunch, not about the weekend, not about anything. I was a utility. A beautifully functioning system, reliable, useful, invisible. When Daniel came back inside, he kissed my temple and said, "What would we do without you?" And everyone laughed. It was meant to be affectionate. But the phrasing lingered. What would we do without you? The subtext was clear. You are the support structure. You are reinforcement. You are background strength, not a partner, not a co-architect, not equal access. Background. That afternoon, As I washed dishes beside his mother, she leaned closer and said softly, "The key to a long marriage is letting a man feel like he's leading." I didn't respond right away. Because here's the thing, I never needed to lead. I just needed to stand beside. But somewhere along the way, standing beside had been reinterpreted as standing behind. And I had complied so smoothly that no one questioned it. Daniel began consulting me less on major decisions. Not dramatically, just gradually. He would inform me rather than involve me. "I'm thinking of investing in this startup." I told my boss I'd be open to relocating in a year or two. I promised Mark we'd host Thanksgiving. Each time, the pronoun was singular. I told. I promised. When I would pause, he'd add, "You're okay with that, right? You're always so flexible." Flexible. That word is dangerous when paired with permanence, because flexibility implies temporary bending. But if you never return to your original position, you're not flexible. You're reshaped. I began recognizing the script. I was the stabilizer, the emotional regulator, the one who absorbed tension so others didn't have to feel it. At gatherings, if Daniel made a joke at my expense, I laughed first to signal safety. If a decision excluded me, I reframed it internally as efficiency. If something stung, I minimized it before anyone else could. I wasn't being silenced, I was volunteering for silence. And that realization was harder to face than any insult. One evening, as I reviewed our monthly budget, something I had quietly managed since before the wedding, I noticed how neatly our finances reflected our dynamic. My contributions are steady, his risks are bold. My planning is meticulous. His spending is impulsive but celebrated as visionary. When returns came in positive, he was praised for his foresight. When risks faltered, I recalibrated behind the scenes to protect us. No one knew how often I adjusted allocations to cushion his decisions. No one noticed because I didn't announce it. I began to understand my assigned role with uncomfortable clarity. Be calm, be competent, be undemanding, be grateful, be supportive. Don't compete, don't correct, don't overshadow. And above all, don't need too much. That night, lying beside Daniel as he slept easily, I stared at the ceiling and asked myself a question I had avoided for months. If I stopped performing this role, who would I be here? The answer was unsettling. I didn't know if our marriage had space for the full version of me, because the version they loved was curated, carefully edited, gentle, predictable, contained. And for the first time, I wondered whether disappearing slowly was something that could be reversed, or whether I had already given too much ground to reclaim. The shift didn't happen during a fight. It happened on an ordinary Wednesday morning, in the quiet space between brushing my teeth and checking my email. I was standing in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting a pair of pearl earrings. Daniel was already dressed, knotting his tie with quick, efficient movements. He glanced at me through the mirror. "By the way," he said casually, "I told my team we're available for dinner Friday. My boss and his wife. Keep it simple. Keep it simple." I watched his reflection as he tightened the knot. He hadn't asked if I was free. He hadn't asked if I wanted to host. He had offered our time the way someone offers extra seating at a table. Normally, I would have nodded, rearranged my schedule, planned a menu, sent a polite confirmation text. But that morning, something inside me didn't react. Not anger, not even hurt, just stillness. I studied my own face in the mirror. Calm, composed, familiar. And I realized something with quiet clarity. If I continue like this, I will disappear completely, and no one will even call it a loss. Because to lose something, you first have to acknowledge it existed. Daniel finished adjusting his tie. You're okay with that, right? There it was again. The assumption dressed as a question. In the past, I would have softened my voice. Of course. Maybe even added, it'll be nice. Instead, I simply said, I have plans Friday. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sharp. It was factual. He blinked, surprised. Oh, with who? With myself, I said, picking up my planner. There was a small pause in the room. Not hostile, just unfamiliar. Well, can you reschedule? He asked. I closed my planner slowly. No, the word didn't echo. It didn't tremble. It just existed. And in that moment, I felt something return to me. Not power over him, power over myself. He frowned slightly. Not angry, but inconvenienced. It's important, Faith. I'm sure it is, I replied. Then maybe you should have checked with me first. I didn't wait for a response. I picked up my bag and left for work. In the car, my hands were steady on the steering wheel. My heart wasn't racing. I wasn't bracing for a fight. I was simply aware. Aware that this was the first time I hadn't automatically folded. At the office, I moved through my day with unusual clarity. Meetings felt sharper. My voice felt firmer. I noticed how naturally I occupied space in professional settings. How no one there seemed confused by my intelligence or my authority. It struck me almost painfully. I was expansive everywhere except at home. That evening, Daniel was polite but distant. He didn't mention Friday again, and I didn't offer to fix it. That was the shift, not confrontation, not rebellion, just the decision to stop preemptively adjusting. Over the next few days, I observed more than I spoke. I watched how often Daniel expected accommodation as the default, how reflexively I had provided it. But now, there was a quiet recalibration happening inside me. I no longer felt the need to prove I was easy. I felt curious instead. Curious what would happen if I stopped managing everyone's comfort. Curious who would notice. And beneath that curiosity was something steadier than anger. Resolve. Because here's what I understood in that bathroom mirror. I didn't need to fight for dominance. I just needed to stop surrendering it. And once you stop surrendering, the entire dynamic begins to shift. After that morning, I didn't transform overnight. I didn't become sharper. I didn't start correcting Daniel publicly. I didn't withdraw affection or initiate conflict. What changed was quieter than that. My silence stopped being automatic. It became deliberate. There's a difference between silence born from fear and silence chosen from awareness. One feels like shrinking. The other feels like stillness before movement. Daniel noticed something, though he couldn't name it. You've been quiet lately, he said one evening while scrolling through his phone. I've always been quiet, I replied calmly. He tilted his head slightly. No, you used to be more engaged. Engaged. I almost smiled at the irony. I hadn't withdrawn. I had simply stopped cushioning. When he exaggerated a story about himself at dinner with friends, I didn't jump in to enhance it. When he forgot to follow through on a commitment, I didn't cover for him. When he made small jokes at my expense, I didn't laugh first to signal approval. I let the moment sit. At first, people filled the gaps themselves. Conversations moved on. Dinners ended. Life continued. But the dynamic was subtly destabilized because I had been the social glue. When Daniel made an offhand comment about my little color-coded planner obsession during a gathering, I didn't roll my eyes playfully. I simply said, it's how I keep our finances stable. The room grew briefly quiet. Not awkward, just attentive. Daniel chuckled. See? Organized. I held his gaze for half a second longer than usual. Not hostile, just present. That was when I realized something powerful. He mistook my composure for compliance. And when compliance disappeared, he didn't know how to categorize me. At home, I stopped volunteering solutions before he asked. If he misplaced something, I let him look for it. If he forgot a bill, I allowed the reminder notice to arrive before calmly addressing it, not to punish, but to rebalance. For years, I had been absorbing friction before it reached him. Now, I allow natural consequences to breathe. He grew mildly irritated at first. You used to remind me, he said once, frustrated over a missed payment. I still can, I answered evenly. If you ask. That word again, ask. The smallest assertion can feel revolutionary in a dynamic built on assumptions. What fascinated me most was how quickly my restraint was interpreted as coldness. You seem distant, he said one night. I'm not distant, I replied. I'm just not anticipating anymore. He didn't fully understand what I meant, but I did. Anticipating his needs had been my reflex. Pre-solving problems had been my love language. But anticipation without reciprocity becomes quiet servitude, and I was done serving invisibly. The shift wasn't loud enough for outsiders to notice. We still attended events, still posted anniversary photos, still hosted dinners when mutually agreed upon. But internally, I was observing, listening more than speaking, documenting patterns, not obsessively, but accurately. Dates, decisions, financial contributions, emotional labor, who initiated, who accommodated. Not for revenge, for clarity. Because if this marriage continued, I needed it to be real. And if it ended, I needed to understand exactly why. Daniel, meanwhile, interpreted my steadiness as moodiness at first, then as stress, then, strangely, as strength. You've been more self contained lately, he said one Sunday afternoon. I think that's healthy, I replied. He nodded slowly, as if evaluating a new version of software he wasn't sure how to use. That's when I understood something subtle but important. When you stop overextending, people call you withdrawn. When you stop overgiving, people call you distant. When you stop over-explaining, people call you mysterious. But none of those labels mean you've changed negatively. They just mean the imbalance is visible now, and visibility can be uncomfortable. I wasn't plotting. I wasn't escalating. I was recalibrating. My silence was no longer an erasure. It was a boundary. And boundaries, when introduced into relationships that relied on quiet sacrifice, often feel like disruption. The disruption had begun. The interesting thing about being underestimated is that it gives you privacy. When people assume you're harmless, they stop monitoring you closely. When they think you're predictable, they stop questioning your movements. Daniel believed my quiet recalibration was an emotional adjustment. Maybe stress, maybe a phase. He never considered preparation. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to leave my marriage. That would imply impulsiveness, and I am not impulsive. I decided to understand it thoroughly. I began with information, not suspicion, not accusation, just data. For years, I had managed our household budget. I knew our mortgage breakdown, our savings rate, and our retirement allocations. But I had always treated everything as shared territory, even when I was the one maintaining it. Now, I created a separate document, private, password protected, a clear snapshot of assets, liabilities, recurring expenses, and discretionary spending. Not because I planned to divide it, because I needed to see it clearly, without emotional fog. What struck me wasn't the imbalance in money, it was the imbalance in narrative. Daniel often described himself as the primary financial driver. He wasn't lying, his income was slightly higher. but my stability had covered his risks more times than he acknowledged. I catalogued those moments calmly. Dates of his speculative investments, months when my bonuses offset losses, times I restructured savings to protect long term goals. No drama, just accuracy. At work, I took on a high visibility crisis project that required late evenings and strategic precision, not to escape home, but to remind myself of my full capability. I wanted tangible proof, not memory. The project succeeded. Senior leadership publicly credited my foresight in a quarterly meeting. I didn't tell Daniel right away. I wanted to see if he'd ask about my week. He didn't. He talked about his. That was data, too. Meanwhile, I reopened conversations with a financial advisor I had consulted briefly before our wedding. At the time, it had been about merging accounts responsibly. Now, it was about understanding options, legal frameworks, asset protection, long term independence. I didn't frame it as divorce planning, I framed it as literacy, because clarity is never wasted. I also began documenting emotional patterns, not in a bitter diary, but in objective language. April 12th, hosted dinner. Daniel promised to handle the wine. Forgot. I compensated. May 3rd, discussed potential relocation. Decision stated, not discussed. May 17th, anniversary post drafted by me. Caption adjusted by him to emphasize career growth year. Reading it back weeks later, the pattern was undeniable. I had been the stabilizer. He had been the centerpiece. And here's what no one noticed. Not Daniel, not his family, not our friends. I stopped defending him in conversations where he misrepresented me. If someone said, Faith's just naturally easygoing, I responded gently, I'm actually very deliberate. If someone implied I didn't mind hosting constantly, I said, I mind when it's assumed. Tiny corrections, calmly delivered. The world didn't collapse. People adjusted. That surprised me more than anything. I also rebuilt small pieces of myself quietly. I resumed weekend solo hikes I had abandoned after the wedding. I reconnected with a former colleague for coffee, someone who saw me as strategic, not supportive. Each action was subtle, but together they formed infrastructure. Daniel occasionally sensed distance, but he interpreted it as independence, not detachment. You've been really focused lately, he observed one night. I have been, I said. He nodded approvingly. He mistook my preparation for ambition within the marriage. He didn't realize I was preparing for the possibility beyond it. And I wasn't angry while doing it. That's the part people misunderstand. I wasn't building a case out of resentment. I was building understanding out of respect for myself. Because if I ever chose to walk away, I wanted it to be irreversible, not because of rage, but because of certainty. By the end of that year, I had something I hadn't possessed before. Not evidence against him, evidence for myself, proof that I was not small, not secondary, not dependent. And once you hold that kind of proof quietly, you stop fearing the outcome. Clarity doesn't arrive like a thunderclap. It arrives like a document sliding across a desk. For me, it was a Tuesday afternoon in a glass-walled conference room downtown. Not dramatic, not emotional. Just fluorescent lighting, a carafe of water, and a woman across from me reviewing numbers with steady precision. Her name was Margaret Hale, a family law attorney I'd been quietly referred to months earlier. I hadn't contacted her in a crisis. I contacted her out of curiosity. I'm not sure I'm getting divorced, I told her during our first meeting. She nodded. Most intelligent women don't come here sure. They come here informed. That sentence stayed with me. Over the course of 3 consultations, spaced across 6 months, We reviewed everything: assets, liabilities, property titles, retirement accounts, my documented financial adjustments, and the timeline of major investments. Margaret wasn't emotional about any of it. She was clinical. And that's what made the reveal so powerful. You're in a far stronger position than you think, she said, sliding a folder toward me. Financially and procedurally. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. Inside that folder wasn't ammunition. It was clarity. Because here's what I had quietly uncovered. The house was jointly titled, but my documented contributions to mortgage stabilization during Daniel's speculative investment losses were substantial and traceable. Our retirement accounts, though merged in narrative, were legally distinguishable. And most importantly, I had maintained detailed records of every major financial decision: who initiated it, who mitigated risk, who absorbed impact, not to accuse, to understand. Margaret looked at me carefully before our final session ended. Are you afraid of leaving? She asked. I considered the question. No, I said slowly. I'm afraid of staying invisible. She didn't smile. She didn't dramatize it. She just nodded. That was the private reveal. Not that I could leave, but I would not be destabilized if I did. At home, Daniel was planning a celebratory dinner for a recent promotion. He had posted about it online before telling me in person. Friends flooded the comments with congratulations. I double tapped the photo like everyone else. That evening, he raised a glass. To growth, he said proudly. To growth, I echoed. And I meant it. Because growth doesn't always look like expansion together. Sometimes it looks like an expansion apart. Over the next few weeks, I reviewed my private documents again. Not obsessively, just calmly. I imagined different futures without emotional distortion. If I stayed, what would need to change? If I left, what would I lose? What struck me most was this: in none of the scenarios did I feel panic. 3 years earlier, the idea of ending my marriage would have felt like failure, social embarrassment, chaos. Now it felt like logistics. That shift told me everything. Daniel, meanwhile, interpreted my composure as loyalty, stability, proof that our marriage was solid despite minor adjustments. He didn't know that my silence was no longer endurance. The assessment was complete. One night, as we prepared for bed, he wrapped an arm around me and said, "We're good, right? We've just been busy." I looked at him in the dim light. "We've been consistent," I said. He smiled, satisfied with that answer. But consistency is not the same as connection. And for the first time, I understood that I wasn't waiting for him to change. I was waiting for myself to decide. The leverage wasn't dramatic. It wasn't secret evidence of betrayal or scandal. It was something far quieter: independence. And once you privately know, you can walk away without collapsing. You begin to ask whether staying is still an act of love or simply habit. The decision didn't come during a fight. It came during an anniversary. 3 years after our marriage had quietly collapsed, Daniel reserved a table at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the Seattle skyline. Candlelight, city lights. A chilled bottle of champagne was waiting when we arrived. From the outside, it was romantic. From the inside, it felt choreographed. We had mastered the choreography. Photos first, glasses raised. A carefully worded caption posted before dessert arrived. 3 years stronger. I watched the likes accumulate on his phone while he described a potential expansion opportunity at work. Halfway through his explanation, he reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I couldn't do this without you," he said. There it was again. Support structure, infrastructure, not partner in vision, partner in maintenance. I looked at our reflections in the restaurant window. Two polished adults, successful, attractive, functional, and emotionally misaligned. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine the next 10 years. If nothing changed, more dinners like this, more posts, more polite laughter, more decisions are presented as fate's accomplice, more subtle shrinking disguised as harmony. There would be no explosive unhappiness, just gradual erosion, and suddenly that felt heavier than conflict. When the check arrived, Daniel toasted again. To us, we've built something solid. I held my glass. Solid. The word echoed strangely because what we had built was stable in appearance, but hollow in intimacy. On the drive home, he reached for my hand over the console. I let him hold it, and I realized something definitive. I was no longer trying to fix us in my head. For years, every dismissal, every small cut had triggered internal problem solving. How do I communicate better? How do I adjust? How do I restore balance? That night, there was no problem solving, only recognition. I had already done the work. I had recalibrated, introduced boundaries, observed patterns, gathered clarity, ensured independence. Nothing shifted at the core. Because the issue wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a worldview. Daniel didn't see me as smaller maliciously. He saw me as smaller comfortably. And comfort is harder to confront than cruelty. By the time we pulled into the driveway, the decision had settled quietly in my chest. Not dramatic, not angry, just final. I would leave, not immediately in spectacle, but deliberately, cleanly, irreversibly. Inside the house, Daniel loosened his tie and said, I'm glad we're not like other couples. No drama, no chaos. I looked at him for a long moment. We've definitely avoided drama, I said softly. He kissed my forehead and went upstairs. That was the last night I slept beside him as a woman still undecided. The next morning, I opened my planner and turned to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote one word: exit. Below it, I began outlining steps: legal consultation, follow up, financial account separation timeline, housing options, communication strategy, not revenge, not exposure, transition. People think decisions like this are fueled by rage. Mine was fueled by absence. Absence of reciprocity, absence of curiosity about me, absence of equal footing. I wasn't leaving because he yelled. I was leaving because he didn't see. And the most dangerous thing about being unseen is this: if you stay long enough, you start to agree. I refused to agree. The decision was made. He just didn't know it yet. Once the decision was made, everything became procedural. There's a strange calm that follows certainty. The emotional turbulence disappears, replaced by sequencing. Step 1: separate finances quietly, not dramatically, not overnight, just methodically. I opened an individual checking account at a different bank during my lunch break. Direct deposit adjustments were scheduled to begin the following quarter, framed as tax optimization, if anyone asked. Daniel didn't ask. He had always trusted me with logistics. It never occurred to him that logistics could shift direction. Step 2: consult Margaret again. I'm ready, I told her. She didn't look surprised. She simply reviewed the timeline with me: what to file, when to notify, how to protect assets without appearing reactive. We agreed on something important: no sudden withdrawals, no suspicious transfers, everything clean, traceable, professional. The goal wasn't to win, it was to exit intact. Step 3: housing. I began researching apartments close to my office, not because I intended to downgrade permanently, but because I wanted mobility, flexibility, a temporary landing place that belonged solely to me. One Saturday morning, while Daniel played golf with colleagues, I toured 3 units: natural light, secure entry, quiet. I signed a short term lease that afternoon, not because I was running, because I was positioning. At home, nothing appeared different. I still cooked occasionally, still attended events when mutually agreed upon, still answered questions about work. But I stopped future planning aloud. When Daniel mentioned a possible relocation next year, I said, "That's interesting." Not "we'll see," not "we can make it work," just acknowledgement. He interpreted my neutrality as maturity. He didn't realize it was detachment. I also gathered personal documents: passport, tax returns, property paperwork, into a single organized file stored in my office drawer at work. It looked like professional diligence. It was. One evening, Daniel casually mentioned refinancing the house to free up capital for another investment. In the past, I would have analyzed projections with him immediately. This time, I said, "Let's pause major changes for a few months." He looked mildly surprised. "Why?" "I want stability for a bit." He shrugged. "Fair." That word told me everything. Fair. Because he still assumed we were aligned long term. Meanwhile, Margaret filed preliminary paperwork discreetly. Drafts were prepared but not served. I reviewed every clause carefully: asset division, timeline, mediation preference. I chose mediation, not because I feared the court, because I refused the spectacle. There were no late night arguments during this phase, no suspicious tension. If anything, Daniel seemed relieved by my composure. He mentioned once, almost approvingly, "You've been really grounded lately." "I am," I replied, and I meant it, because moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about steadiness. By the time the paperwork was finalized and ready for formal delivery, my separate account was active. My lease was secured. My essentials were gradually packed into unremarkable storage boxes labeled "office files" in the garage. No drama, just progression. The most surreal part was this: he truly didn't see it coming, not because I hid aggressively, but because he had grown accustomed to believing that I would adapt indefinitely. Underestimation is a powerful blindfold. The night before everything shifted from private preparation to public reality, I stood in the kitchen alone. Same counters, same soft lighting, same rain against the windows. 3 years of performance had happened in this space. 6 months of quiet collapse before that. I didn't feel rage. I felt gratitude. Gratitude that I had chosen. Clarity before resentment hardened me. The next morning, the process would begin officially. Not with shouting, with paperwork. And paperwork, unlike emotion, doesn't negotiate. The envelope sat on the kitchen counter between us. Daniel had just come home from work. Loosened tie, familiar footsteps, the faint scent of cologne and rain. He noticed the papers immediately. "What's this?" he asked casually, setting down his keys. "Something we need to discuss," I replied. He opened it without urgency. That changed quickly. I watched his eyes move across the first page, then the second. His posture straightened, not dramatically, just instinctively. "Divorce?" he said, not loudly, just incredulous. "Faith, what is this?" "It's the beginning of a transition," I answered. He looked up at me as if trying to recalibrate reality. "Transition?" He let out a short, confused breath. "We're fine. We've been fine." There it was. Perception versus experience. "I haven't been fine," I said evenly. He ran a hand through his hair, scanning the document again. "Why didn't you say something? We could have talked." "I did," I replied softly. "Just not in ways that disrupted you." That landed heavier than anything else I could have said. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Daniel wasn't angry. He was destabilized. The first stage wasn't rage, it was confusion. "This feels extreme," he said carefully. "We don't fight. We don't have scandals. We're not miserable. We're not connected," I answered. He stared at me like the word was abstract. Connected had never been his metric. Stability was. Over the next few days, the consequences rippled outward quietly. He slept less. I noticed the light under the office door late at night. He began asking questions he hadn't asked in years. Are you unhappy with me? What did I miss? When did this start? The answers weren't explosive, gradual, subtle, years ago. That unsettled him more than if I'd cited a single dramatic incident. Because drama can be fixed, erosion cannot. Friends began texting after he confided in one or two close colleagues. Is everything okay? You two always seemed solid. This is surprising. I responded with the same line each time. It's been a long process. No accusations, no exposés, no airing of grievances. Just truth without spectacle. At home, Daniel oscillated between problem solving and disbelief. We can go to counseling, he suggested one evening. We could, I agreed. But counseling works best before someone has already let go. He flinched slightly at that. Let go. For him, the loss was sudden. For me, it had been unfolding for years. He began noticing things he'd previously overlooked. The separate bank notifications, the packed boxes in the garage, the absence of future-oriented language in my conversations. How long have you been planning this? He asked quietly one night. Long enough to be sure, I replied. And that was the part he struggled with most. Not that I was leaving, but I was calm. There were no screaming matches to point to, no betrayal he could condemn, no villain to assign blame to, just a woman who had reached the end of her willingness to be unseen. His parents called, concerned but measured. We thought you two were happy, his mother said gently. We were functional, I corrected. Functionality is easy to admire from a distance. Intimacy requires proximity. Daniel started trying in small ways, offering to cook dinner, asking about my day with more focus, and suggesting weekend trips. They weren't manipulative gestures, they were late. And lateness in relationships carries weight. The consequences weren't explosive, they were quiet recalibrations. He began feeling what I had felt for years: uncertainty, imbalance. The ground is shifting without a clear cause. And for the first time, he experienced the discomfort of not being consulted about a major life decision. Not out of revenge, but because consultation requires partnership, and the partnership had been absent for a long time. As the days passed, reality settled into the house like a new temperature. He understood now that something irreversible had begun. And the most unsettling realization for him was this: there was no dramatic mistake to fix, only a pattern he had never noticed until it was too late. Panic doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like effort. Sudden, concentrated, unfamiliar effort. 2 weeks after the papers were served, Daniel transformed into a version of himself I hadn't seen in years. He asked questions before making plans. He came home earlier. He silenced his phone at dinner. One evening, he cooked without announcing it as a favor. I made reservations for counseling, he said carefully, setting a plate in front of me. Just to talk. No pressure. I looked at him, really looked at him. This wasn't manipulation. It wasn't ego. It was fear. Fear of loss. And that's when I understood something painful. He valued me most once I was leaving, not when I was shrinking, not when I was adjusting, not when I was quietly absorbing the imbalance, but when I became finite. We attended one counseling session. The therapist asked neutral professional questions about communication patterns, emotional needs, and shared goals. Daniel spoke earnestly. He described me as stable, loyal, intelligent, grounding. He said he had always assumed we were strong enough to handle anything. Strong enough. I listened. When it was my turn, I didn't list grievances. I said, I stopped feeling seen a long time ago. The room went quiet. Daniel frowned slightly. I've always seen you. You've relied on me. I answered gently. That's not the same. The distinction landed. In subsequent days, he began replaying history aloud. Was it when I took that investment risk? Was it the relocation conversation? Was it something I said at dinner? I shook my head each time. It was the pattern, I said, not the moments. He struggled with that because moments can be apologized for. Patterns require identity shifts. One night, he sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same place where so many subtle dismissals had once felt insignificant. I can change, he said quietly. I believed him, but here's the truth people rarely admit. Change offered under threat feels different than change offered in awareness. I didn't doubt his capacity. I doubted the sustainability. You might, I said, but I can't stay to see if it lasts. His jaw tightened, not in anger, but in helplessness. You're not even angry, he said, almost frustrated. That's what makes this impossible. If you were furious, I'd know how to respond. I almost smiled at that. He wanted heat. Heat can be negotiated. Calm is harder. I passed anger a long time ago, I told him. That was the moment he understood the timeline mismatch. For him, this was a sudden crisis. For me, it was delayed execution. Friends and family began suggesting reconciliation gently. Every marriage has phases. Don't give up too quickly. Too quickly. 3.5 years of erosion is not quick. Daniel started noticing the house differently. The way I had arranged furniture, the meal planning systems, the calendar coordination. I didn't realize how much you handled, he admitted one evening. I know, I said. There was no satisfaction in that acknowledgement, just confirmation. As my move out date approached, he oscillated between hope and resignation. Some days, he spoke about when we figure this out. On other days, he asked practical questions about asset division. The reality was settling in, not with a bang, but with weight. The hardest part wasn't that he hadn't loved me. It was that he had loved the version of me that required the least from him. And now that I required departure, he finally saw the cost. But seeing cost isn't the same as reversing consequence. By the time someone realizes what they've been standing on, the foundation has already shifted, and I had already stepped off it. The final conversation happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon. No raised voices, no dramatic pacing, just two adults sitting across from each other at the dining table that had hosted 3 years of curated normalcy. My boxes were already stacked neatly near the hallway. Not many. I had never been attached to excess. Daniel looked tired, not physically, but internally, like someone who had been replaying footage in his mind for weeks, searching for a scene he could edit. Before you go, he said carefully, I need to understand something. I nodded. Why didn't you fight harder for us? The question wasn't accusatory. It was bewildered. I folded my hands on the table, steady. I did, I said, just not loudly. He frowned slightly. I adjusted. I communicated. I introduced boundaries. I waited to see if the balance would shift. That was me fighting. He leaned back, absorbing it. I thought we were just comfortable, he said. We were, I agreed. You were comfortable. Silence stretched between us, but it wasn't hostile. It was reflective. I never meant to make you feel small, he said. I know, I replied. And I did. That's what made this harder to explain to outsiders. There was no villain, no betrayal headline, no explosive wrongdoing, just a dynamic that had calcified in his favor. Daniel looked at the planner resting beside my bag. You wrote all this down, didn't you? He asked quietly. Yes. For how long? Long enough to be certain. He exhaled slowly. I would have listened if you'd told me it was this serious. I met his eyes. I needed you to notice without a crisis forcing you to. That was the core of it. I didn't want a transformation born from fear of losing myself. I wanted awareness born from valuing myself. He rubbed his hands together, thinking. So this is it? He asked finally. Yes. No tremor, no bitterness, just completion. He nodded slowly, as if signing something invisible. I wish I'd seen it sooner, he said. So do I. We sat there a moment longer, not as adversaries, but as two people acknowledging a shared miscalculation. I never thought you'd be the one to leave, he admitted. That almost made me smile. Neither did you, I said gently. There it was. The underestimation, finally named without hostility. He had assumed I would endure indefinitely, because I always had. Because I was calm, because I was reasonable, because I didn't threaten. But calm does not mean compliant. Reasonable does not mean limitless. And quiet does not mean weak. He stood and walked me to the door. No dramatic embrace, no collapse, just a brief, steady hug. I hope you find what you're looking for, he said. I already have, replied softly. He looked confused for a split second, then understood. Myself. As I stepped outside, the air felt clear, not triumphant, not tragic. Clear. The confrontation hadn't required volume. It required certainty. And certainly, when delivered without heat, leaves no space for argument. The door closed gently behind me. No slamming, just finality. It's been a year since I closed that door. Not dramatically, not in flames, just quietly. I live in a sunlit apartment 10 minutes from my office. The walls are neutral, the furniture intentional, the silence unshared. The first few nights felt unfamiliar, not lonely, just unbuffered. There's a difference. When you've spent years anticipating someone else's needs, the absence of that responsibility feels almost like forgetting an appointment. You keep checking for something that no longer requires your attention. I still carry my Navy planner, but the entries look different now. No coded emotional notes, no tracking of who adjusted for whom, no quiet documentation of imbalance. Just plans, goals, travel ideas, personal projects. For the first time in years, my life isn't structured around stabilization. It's structured around expansion. At work, I accepted a promotion that requires more visibility, more direct authority, more presence in rooms where strategy is shaped, not softened. The first time I presented a high stakes proposal solo, I felt something almost electric in my chest. Not nerves, recognition. I wasn't rediscovering myself. I was reclaiming space I had always occupied elsewhere, but withheld at home. Friends ask sometimes, carefully, do you regret it? I answer honestly, no. Not because divorce is painless. It isn't. There are evenings when memory arrives unexpectedly. Shared jokes, familiar rituals, a particular way he used to reach for my hand in crowded rooms. But I don't mistake nostalgia for compatibility anymore. I've learned that missing someone doesn't mean you belonged together. It just means you shared history. Daniel and I finalized everything through mediation, exactly as planned. The process was respectful, structured, clean. We don't speak often now. When we do, it's cordial, brief, human. I don't resent him. That surprises people the most. But resentment requires ongoing emotional investment. I've closed that account. What I've gained is harder to describe than what I left. It's not freedom in the loud cinematic sense. It's alignment. When someone asks my opinion now, I don't soften it before speaking. When I disagree, I don't wrap it in apology. When I need something, I state it plainly. And here's the quiet truth I carry with me. The world didn't collapse when I stopped being easy. It adjusted. People still value me, respect me, invite me in. The difference is that I now occupy space as myself, not as a carefully edited version designed to minimize discomfort. I used to believe love meant adaptation without limit. Now I understand it differently. Love should expand you, not require you to contract. I don't know what my next relationship will look like. I'm not rushing toward one. For now, I'm learning how to exist without preemptively shrinking. How to sit at tables, literal and metaphorical, without volunteering for the corner seat. How to let silence be thoughtful, not self erasing. If there's one identity shift that defines this chapter of my life, it's this. I'm no longer the stabilizer of someone else's comfort. I am the architect of my own. And that feels less like dominance and more like peace. When people hear my story, they often look for a villain. There isn't one. Daniel wasn't cruel, I wasn't dramatic. There was no explosive betrayal, no scandalous reveal, no public unraveling. There was just a slow imbalance that went unnamed for too long. We kept pretending for 3 years after the marriage had already collapsed. We smiled in photos. We hosted dinners. We toasted anniversaries. We performed stability so convincingly that even we started believing it at times. But performance has an expiration date. And the quietest kind of loss, the kind where you disappear inch by inch, is still loss. If there's a lesson in this, it isn't leave at the first sign of discomfort. It's this: pay attention to patterns, not promises. Notice how often you shrink to keep something peaceful. Notice whether your silence feels chosen or required. Notice whether you are loved for who you are or for how little you demand. I don't regret loving him. I don't regret trying. But I do respect the moment I stopped negotiating my own visibility. Quiet dominance isn't about overpowering someone, it's about refusing to abandon yourself. Sometimes strength looks like staying and working. Sometimes strength looks like leaving without spectacle. For me, strength looked like certainty delivered calmly. No shouting, no humiliation, no revenge. Just a woman who realized that being unseen for too long eventually becomes a choice. And she chose differently. If you've ever found yourself smiling in a relationship that felt empty, if you've ever wondered whether you're overreacting to small things that never seem to stop, I'd love to know. At what point do you think quiet endurance becomes self erasure?